IMF has predicted a looming debt crisis in Africa, which is the fact that many African countries may likely fall into debt crisis. What will be the impact of these, and what should be the necessary call to actions for these African countries? We have our in-house analyst here with us. We're being joined by Jide Taiwo.
Thank you. Thank you for.
I almost said Otumba Jide Taiwo.
Oh no, so I'm a prince. And prince don't collect chieftaincy titles. That's how it goes.
Okay, maybe soon it will be His Royal Majesty.
That's a long-term plan.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
All right, glad to have you join us. So quickly, I need you to react to this report, the projection being made by IMF that the looming debt crisis in Africa, where most of these African countries are at the verge of falling into debt recession. Your take on that?
I mean, that cannot be surprising to anybody. Over the last 3 to 4 years, African countries have had contraction in their economies that were exacerbated by the COVID crisis. Now, it's an interesting conundrum when the COVID thing hits. The UK is officially in a recession now, right? And that's a much bigger economy than most places in Africa. So for African countries, we were in a dilemma. Do we shut down our borders? Do we stop operations to curtail the spread of COVID as happened in Europe and America? That's exactly what we did. Unfortunately, our markets are not as advanced as theirs, but we are now suffering even worse than them because our earning power is low. We have low resources, or the use of our resources is low compared to other places in the world. So it's not surprising that these countries, and you can name them, Zimbabwe, Ghana, for instance, that was a lot of people thought Ghana was the next big thing, but Ghana is officially in a recession. So it's not surprising that these debt crises are going to rear their heads, and it's not surprising what the projections are.
When the IMF said that the African countries are going to stay at a debt higher than pre-pandemic level through 2024 and 2024. As Africans, you won't feel like, ouch, IMF, what's that prophecy of doom? But let's look at it. It's almost a reality even at now. But people some economists have said the problem actually is not with borrowing, it's what you borrow for.
That's
right. So all of those monies that have been borrowed by African leaders, in your assessment, does it look like they've been judiciously used? Because if they borrowed to solve economic problems, should there be a return plan or a plan to service the debt at least, if not repay them?
So I'm of the opinion that what we need from the rest of the world, the IMF inclusive, is, equitable trade. Help us to trade better than give us loans that we cannot pay for. I'll give you the Nigerian example, the Nigerian issue, for example. So we've had to remove subsidies. We've had to float our currency because prior to now, we were borrowing to pay subsidies and borrowing to defend the currency. At a point, it will bottom out. And that's why we have this issue that we have in Nigeria. So when, the IMF makes these projections, they are making those projections in, as legal practitioners say, ceteris paribus, right? All things being equal. It's never equal in Africa. Our needs are unique. Our trade has to be unique. We can't just do like how it's done globally. So 1 + 1 in America and Europe has to be 1. In Nigeria, it has to be 111. Because before you do the subtraction and addition, you first have to clear your goods at the markets. It will take you 8 hours to get out of it. All of these things add up to what will now create this fine mess. So for the IMF, for other global agencies, I believe very strongly that we need to trade more. They need to pay us top dollar for our resources than give us these loans that we cannot afford to service, let alone pay back.
Now, looking at the statistics, Egypt is first on the list with about $11.9 billion, and Nigeria is at number 6.
That's interesting. Pardon me that I cut you off, because Egypt supposedly is one of the biggest economies in Africa. The issues that we deal with in sub-Saharan Africa, Egypt doesn't deal with it. So that tells you that the African continent cannot be treated like a European country. Pardon me, sorry that I...
No, it's good. It's a conversation, so it's good. But the issue is, borrowing is a universal practice. If you look at the trend in Africa, it is what the borrowing is meant for and the essence of transparency that is being deployed into it. Now, this conversation comes in. Now, looking at this debt profile, the advocacy for cutting the cost of governance. Don't you think it is time for that to fly now?
In fairness, I do not see how we are going to cut the cost of governance enough to make a dent. And I'll tell you why. So, we run a very expensive form of government in this part of the world, right? You know, we run a presidential system that is started after the American democracy. America had a 200-year head start than most places in Africa that are practicing these things. So what are you going to take out? Now, people will make the argument that we should have we should have a unicameral legislation where you have only one set of representatives. So how are you going to ensure that these same senators and legislators are the ones that are going to make the law to say, oh, make the law that I'll be out of job by next year? I think it's fantasy that is unlikely to happen. Yes, we want to say cost in governance, but what are you going to take out, right? The president and executive heads are entitled to certain things. So none of them are going to say, oh, I love you so much, I'm not going to take my allowances. It's not going to happen. But how do we ensure that we create systems that are not going to leave the people impoverished, such that these things, will not be on the crisis level?
All right. Now, the report has it that the high debt profile that a lot of African countries have started to rise even a decade before the COVID pandemic broke out. So that means that there's been quite a trend of misuse of borrowings even before that time. But would it have made any difference if the debts that African countries owe were more domestic than foreign?
So where are we going to get enough domestic loan? Right? Is Nigeria going to loan to Ghana? Is Ghana going to loan to Kenya?
What about loaning? What about getting from, as Nigeria government is currently doing sometimes, from the capital markets and some other?
Yeah, so that's no longer a loan. If you are raising treasury bills, you are selling bonds, that's no longer a loan. But if you are taking these loans, and I agree, Africa has not done well in the last 10 to 15 years in the use of the loans that we've been obtaining. Ghana, if you talk to Ghanaians, they'll let you know. So they've had presidents that borrowed money and didn't do anything with it. In Nigeria, we had the same. People that have borrowed money, that have not created infrastructure or agriculture or whatever it is that we do, that have not invested in it. We've borrowed money to spend, not borrowed money to build. And if you don't build, there's no way you can earn enough money for you to survive. So that's what we're saying. So yes, I'm a big proponent of treasury bills, bonds, and all of these things as opposed to loan. Loan itself is not the problem. It's our ability to service it and pay it back. And then all of these, agencies have to look at us differently. Yes, we know that it's at a certain percentage. Can you help us by doing 3% less or 300 basis points less? These are conversations that we should have, because the truth of the matter is we simply cannot pay these loans, as it were.
But is it time to ask for debt forgiveness? Will that even happen, considering globally what's happening in other climes?
In other climes, it's unlikely to happen because other economies in the world are experiencing the same recession and everything. But if that's what we need to know, we need to beg for. Let us beg forgiveness, offsetting, reduction, whatever it is, so that they don't feel hard done by. Oh, you guys just collected our money and you didn't do anything for it, and you're asking us now to write stuff. Can you help us put a timeline to it? Can you give us 10, 15 years to address all of these things? But I think it's unlikely to happen, because we also have to look at what's happening in Europe and Ukraine that have pretty much stifled the entire European continent. So these are conversations that we had, and that's why diplomacy is very fantastic. We can have these conversations, we pull, we push, and we find a common ground.
Nigeria once had debt forgiveness. Has it made things better? That's the question. But let's wrap up by looking at the issue of transparency and accountability. Because when it comes to the administering of public funds or the issue of loans, that issue of transparency is very crucial. How do we achieve this? Just extend it to the African continent, not just Nigeria alone.
So I think that citizens, and I hate to put it on citizens, but I think that citizens will have to mount pressure. We've seen across different countries that the ruling class will do what they want to do if they are allowed to get away with it. So I think it's for us as Africans to mount that pressure on our representatives. They work for us, not the other way around. So if we have this pressure on them, we've seen, the Nigerian presidency, for instance, make certain gestures that I think is unprecedented. We haven't seen it yet. So that means that if we shout louder and harder, things can be done. So they cannot ignore all of us for forever. But we also have to now collect our thoughts and decide what is it that we want the most. So do we want them to be more transparent in the use of public funds? Yes. How do we do that? By attending, your local congressmen, and I say congressmen because I'm stuck in the US, your local representatives. If you take a sample of many Nigerians, we don't know who our councillor is, and those guys get paid on a monthly basis. So what are they doing with the money? They obtain grants, they obtain loans on our behalf, and we are not seeing this in our community. So I think it starts by us being very, very harsh in our demand for government to be accountable to the people.
All right, thank you very much, the Jide Taiwo.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, what a great way to end the show. We do hope that, maybe when all Africans pray, debt forgiveness can happen. When Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala made that happen when she was Minister of Finance in Nigeria in the first democratic regime after the military regime in Nigeria, it seemed like, what did she do? Big deal? But now we're beginning to see that really it is a big deal. Maybe it will happen again, but it will only be a miracle. But appeal to African leaders, whatever monies you have collected or intend to collect, think of the future. Do not mortgage the future of Africans with money that collect and you don't use judiciously. I am Blessing the Ayi Chain. That's been the show today. We'll see you again tomorrow, 8 a.m. West African time. Stay with Souq News.
And from me to you, whatever resources you have at your disposal, it could be material resources, it could be money, use them well, maximize it well, because everything big in life starts from little. Don't forget, Early Exchange returns tomorrow. I am Femi Ayodele. Bye for now.
Early Exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.